Well, welcome to everybody. Welcome to the first one of our New Year's season, 2024. And it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. I don't think there's any major notices to give you, except to welcome you all and to say that it's our very great pleasure to introduce I've forgotten my script, actually. Well, not my script. My aide memoir. We've just had such a lovely evening meal talking together. I've completely forgotten what I wanted to say. Anyway, we're all delighted to welcome our new dean. I don't know how much longer one goes on saying new for, but David Montieth, and as you all know, I'm sure, a Northern Irish Anglican. I don't know how many others there are in East Kent. I'm from Enniskillen. He was Dean of Leicester from 2013 to 2022, and it's, I don't know whether he's proud of the fact that he's known most of all for the fact that Richard III is now buried in Leicester Cathedral, or there must be other things that he is equally proud of, I'm sure. He was educated at Durham University, where he studied theology, which intrigued me, but then was a student at Nottingham Theological College and became ordained, spent time in Wimbledon, so moving his way down south through England, and then went back up to Leicester, and then on to us. He's chair of the College of Deans, and he's a keen gardener and poetry reader. But I didn't have a chance at supper to ask you about your favourite poets, because a lot of people know here that I'm very, very fond of poetry as well. So that's another conversation, another time. And we're here tonight to hear him talk to us about theological reflections on ministry in the church today. We're very, very pleased to welcome him. There'll be time for questions after the talk, but for now, let us welcome David Montieth.
Thank you very much. I've got no whizzy technology. I'm simply going to speak, and hopefully then we can engage in some conversation. Theological reflections on ministry in contemporary British society. So a few introductory words. Theological reflections. Well, I take such reflections to be an attempt to speak about God. There are many implications, perhaps, of what I want to say, but we may choose how we may choose or live as people within the wider community, either as Christians or as members of society. But it's God questions which I'm trying to be concerned with this evening. And for clarity, since one comes at God questions with a whole lot of baggage, I come as a practicing Christian, and for the sake of many theological shortcuts, specifically as one who understands God to be real, rather than just a way of speaking. This God is a God who is free to act, and for me as a Christian who did that supremely in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. I say and believe the Catholic creeds, whilst being curious about all of it. And so I see theological reflections as explorations about the truth of things relating to God, with a clear caveat that that word truth within my tradition comes to understand it as being nuanced in ways starting from the premise that truth is primarily derived from a person, Jesus, rather than truth as proposition. So for me, theological reflections are embodied reflections involving people and texts and traditions. Then ministry. I understand ministry to be about the practice of Christian faith rooted in a corporate understanding of the body of Christ, springing from baptism. It's never confined to the ordained. However, my own experience of ministry is very shaped by my life as a Church of England deacon and priest, who is also dean of a cathedral, one sometimes described as the mothership of the Anglican Communion. And you will come at these questions about ministry shaped by other traditions and experiences, but I want to be upfront about where I'm coming from. And I'd like to note that my question seems to assume that there are particular challenges and opportunities in this time, and I believe that to be so. However, these new contemporary situations lie within a context of Christian ministry, which I think is common down the centuries and across cultures. And for me, these ongoing insights are also seen as embodied practices. Firstly, living a life of prayer. This intentional communication involving listening and speaking with and to God. This is regular, daily, and in my view is a non-negotiable disciplined framework for every single aspect of ministry. For me, my confidence in God is bedrock, and I think within the Church needs to be the same for anyone who claims to exercise Christian ministry. God matters. Secondly, it's pastoral, in that it's worked out with and for others in the context of their well-being and flourishing. Authentic pastoral practice ranges from ensuring the cleaner is paid properly, to answering emails, to practical care and spiritual counsel. I think of it, the pastoral, as the poise of ministry, even if my time is spent doing many things that others may not necessarily think of being pastoral. People matter. Thirdly, it's missional, or we could say kingdom of God focused. It is the attempt to be aligned with the vision of God declared by Jesus of Nazareth in announcing his mission when he quotes Prophet Isaiah in chapter 65, and then as recounted in his sermon in the synagogue in Nazareth, as recounted in Luke 4. Of course, being missional is more than that sermon, but it cannot be any less than that sermon. And in too many cases, propping up the institution of the Church has replaced missional vision. The world matters. These three are constant. God matters, people matters, and the world matters. Much else may be peculiar and particular, but these things are timeless. And then contemporary British society. I'm taking contemporary to mean now, not even 2 years ago. That's historic, because things are shifting fast. This would have been a very different talk 2 years ago. And I'm taking British to refer to life on this island. I'm leaving Northern Ireland out because it's not part of Britain, and if I included it, the things I would say would also be different. However, I do assume there is something called society. I know that wasn't popular at one time in the past. Or at least if not society, societies that have identity, power, purpose, resources, and structures. There's agency in the group, in the collective, in addition to there being agency in the individual. And of course, our context is rightly and wonderfully of a diverse secular society, which at best has space for the practice of all faiths and none. We have a Christian heritage, but we are not a Christian society. I don't say that as a point of judgment, but I think a point of fact. And the Church, especially as expressed in my denomination in the Church of England, is still enormously privileged as the established Church. But in truth, it has little actual power. A tiny bit of soft power, but not much else. And the recent coronation played out much of this at both popular and deeper levels. There was a great deal of reminiscence, a great deal of intrigue, of beauty, of wonder, of celebration, but also a great deal of perplexing. What on earth was going on? I'm in the middle of it, and I didn't understand half of it. We are between times, I think, where epochs and eras are transitioning, but it is impossible to predict how long this interim transitional space might last. Even now, we hear much less talk of postmodernism, but whatever is to follow modernism, it has certainly not yet landed. Certainly, the ideas, technologies, processes, and norms of modernism are crumbling at speed and failing us. But the details and time frames of this epoch shift in British society are not predictable. In fact, there is growing unpredictability in nearly every sphere of life. And such great uncertainty could lead to great creativity and inventiveness, or it could lead to an almighty mess. It's hard to know. So to use the gardening motif, that's kind of clearing the ground. That's now where we're standing, okay? I want to just reflect briefly on 5 areas. And they are brief reflections, and each of them, I hope, open up a series of questions that we might explore further in our conversation. Firstly, technology. As human ingenuity and inquiry has developed, so has our ability to question the nature and purpose of God. And in my mind, we are living through the second major technological revolution of the Christian community. The first related to printing and enabled the Reformation. Ideas that had been fermenting for decades, if not centuries, delivered changed insights about God. Some rediscovering neglected old ideas, and other developments which led to new theological traditions. But it only happened because of technology. Luther, for example, didn't invent justification by faith, but instead he drew on what had been neglected theologically. And it took shape in that particular way because of wider developments in society that were going on with respect to jurisprudence. There was wide talk about justice and the nature of it going on in society, and so Luther speaks about justice within the frame of God. Luther made justification a principle relating to the beyond, but only because there was widespread understanding of what was going on in the here and now and around. And that may perhaps give us a clue about how we might proceed theologically with care in a time of change. We're in the midst of the e-revolution, which has already reshaped our lives in a very short period of time. And we are just beginning to see what far-reaching implications are ahead of us with artificial intelligence, nanotechnologies, new medical technologies, and space exploration. The egalitarianism which emerged in the Enlightenment and in the Reformation is now taken to a new level, where a nomadic herdswoman with a mobile phone has potentially as much influence as the wealthiest, most powerful politician in the world through e-connectivity. The years of steady or even evolutionary development in society which characterize modernism are now largely meaningless. So modernism would think that development and growth in society goes something like, well, you start sorting out basic things like plumbing and healthcare, then you build roads and you improve connectivity, you develop markets for exchange of ideas and things. And eventually such a journey leads you to a modern person and a modern society. But in this new world, the so-called gains of modernism become potentially meaningless. A nomadic herdswoman can trade with everybody else across the world. They can communicate. She can educate herself. She doesn't need to go to a university. They're pointless institutions now. She can even order medicines from California and do it all without leaving her mud shelter on the side of an isolated hillside whilst milking her goats later that day. The world is changing. And whilst there are many with vested interests in keeping the scaffolding of modernism in place, and particularly keeping its economies nurtured, there is another world in emergence. Rather than evolutional, this new world is more sporadic, more like a moment of revelation with a new intervention of previously hidden light and wisdom that hasn't come out necessarily of a long tradition of evolution. Those shaped by ideas of gradual evolutionary change, such as, for example, the standard right and left of Western politics, we see no longer command, support, and authority. Instead, the madder you are, the more likely you are to get elected. Populism doesn't rely on modernist ideals at all. Every aspect of life, from the shape and nature of the individual, the family, the community, and society, change because of what printing unleashed in the Reformation and which was developed in the Enlightenment. And so now with the new eras of technology. The categories of language, the semiology of ethics, the precise meaning of great concepts such as truth are now being reshaped by the technology. The worry is there will be a huge loss of extremely valuable things. The joy will be that of new discovery and insight. A good example is the emergence of broadcasting by individuals or communities. In fact, I think we're doing it this evening. Something that previously only belonged to the state or to powerful conglomerates. Now, meetings, conversations, acts of worship, events are described as virtual, hybrid, as well as in person. We sort of knew what we were doing in the old world, and what we meant by things when we said something like the word person, even if the insights of psychology and psychotherapy meant that we were alert to the complexities of such words. But now new dynamics come into play. What does it mean to be meeting online with someone, encountering somebody in a shirt and tie, yet in that person's home, they're sat in their underwear, unknown to you? Does that, or how does that change the relationship? What does it mean to be in a meeting with the video switched off because at the same time you're helping your child to do their homework? What does a funeral now mean when we participate in it online? We say it's better than not being there, but what is it? And therefore, what do we or can we mean by the nature of God, when the sacramental life of the church has been dependent up to now on physical realities, a succession of laying on of hands, bread, wine, and water as physical things with metaphysical meanings? Yet now the categories of real and unreal, of real and virtual, are not entirely separate. It seems to me that our religious language needs reconsideration, because words such as virtual or real do now actually bear theological weight. But yet how can they properly bear that weight without drawing on the great traditions? How can a word such as virtual be used frequently to describe our relationship with God, when that word also means unreal, inauthentic, or even immature? But in the new world, the virtual apparently can be real, and if it's real, it may even be truthful. As with the First Reformation, I imagine there will be less considered stories, traditions, and practices in our tradition which will emerge to shape this theological discourse. You can imagine, for example, ways of speaking about seeing visions or dreaming dreams which might speak fresh with renewed intelligibility. And all of it will have great social impact. The printing press fed into an imaginative scientific adventure that led ultimately to industry, a shift from the rural to the urban, a shift to a worker-based productive economy. Now we head to a world where the vast majority of production becomes fully automated. So any thoughts about employing the masses becomes highly unlikely. And as before, we saw religious renewal accompany the Industrial Revolution. I'd be surprised if big existential religious questions don't arise from these sociological and technological changes. What life is to be and what it is to be for, in addition to how or what or where is God. That was technology. Climate. Climate change is happening, and we, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, have taken too many chances and are nowhere near responding adequately to the crisis. We see, as a result of the failures of modernism, that our global political institutions are inadequate to address it. Our local and national politics is so shaped by short-termism that every government does nowhere near enough. And we in the church are still waking up. I bought my first green theology book 35 years ago. It provided an adequate and comprehensive theology of creation and its stewardship, and it's been well articulated many times. but it's far from owned either by the church or by the community. I face the huge challenge of turning a medieval cathedral, its precincts, properties, communities, and behaviours into an entirely carbon zero operation, apparently by 2030. And at every turn there is resistance. Technology is not quite there yet, but you can just begin to imagine what will happen when the new Dean of Canterbury starts putting up solar panels, builds a wind turbine in the precincts, and digs up Green Court for ground source heating. All three are firmly on my agenda. We'll see whether or not a well-articulated theology of creation has impacted or not. However, beyond such practical questions, there are further theological ones. Our tradition of speaking of God as creator has theological roots in the attempt to distinguish God from creation. God as maker and even designer, but not God as created or part of creation. So in the Bible, we get the reshaping of ancient non-Jewish theological ideas in the first chapters of the book of Genesis, to make it clear that God is maker, not made. And that's been a wise insight. But it didn't always adequately highlight how God nevertheless is known in creation, the sustainer of creation as well as the actor who creates it. Where is a theology of natural revelation alongside a theology of revealed revelation? And this is, I think, especially tricky, since it is the ordering and patterning of creation which is deemed to be evidence for the actions of a rational, orderly creator, the one who brings order out of primordial chaos, with then the attendant laws that make creation intelligible. So we have light and dark, day and night, sea and land, work and rest. But research at nano and macro scientific levels currently sometimes purports a genuine incomprehensibility about the actual nature of things. Not just that we don't know stuff, but actually there's stuff that cannot be known in any way that we currently know. We can really speak of chaos as a means by which the world is ordered. And this will now become de facto the case in lived experience of creation as climate change continues. Stable atmospheres and ecologies have been generally the thing which has allowed creation to flourish with adaptation to such over time. And that adaptation has created greater comprehensibility and greater order. However, the very atmosphere and overall system of creation is entering a phase of instability not seen perhaps since the most recent ice ages. What we might say or understand about the nature of God when the very creation that is coming into being and being sustained is not ordered, or is not ordered in ways we can recognize, but instead is, if I can use the phrase, routinely chaotic. Storms and floods are currently the exceptions. What happens when they are the norm? We have asserted that God was in the order, but now the order is to become chaotic. Is God chaotic? We will need to account for the creation of disorder within climate change as not just being a consequence of sin and abuse, but part ultimately of the ongoing economy and activity of God. I suspect this will lead to a renewed sense of the deep providence of God, the sense of a much longer view, the sense of the beauty that can emerge from catastrophe, the renewed cooperation between peoples that enabled survival and thriving, not to mention the renewed interdependence of all animals and plants. We do have some very old language that may speak afresh to the new levels of environmental catastrophe. We've been reading in morning prayer at the cathedral the last days the story of Noah and his ark. And as I read it, knowing I was giving this talk, I did not read a quaint children's story, but a deep cry and a deep hope for survival as the chaos emerged. Thirdly, the state and its apparatus. National identity, infrastructure, governance, economy, all these things depend on adequate levels of stability to work at least well enough. And there are countless examples of where basic systems are breaking down. For example, the well-known levels of need in elderly care or for children with additional needs. All the needs are soaring, but they're not working. Equally, on a day like today, we may speak about managing borders and immigration, but more realistically, we are in a world which is on the move. Things such as food banks would have 20 years ago been seen as state failures. Instead, now we support them. The prophet Jeremiah sounds similarly depressing in his analysis of his society, but in him and in others we discover a version of prophecy which was simply to name what he saw. I sense our reluctance to name it because we're fearful. And in our post-secular world, faith and theology have not entirely disappeared or stopped naming these things, but they are minority and they exist in new space. However, since it is both a new space and sphere of influence, and since the system itself in which it operates is also in flux, this then requires high degrees of discernment in what is said, what can be said, and in what is done. I do not despair in this situation, but I also know that the questions I asked 25 years ago as a priest about how God is at work in society and the world are different now. And they're far more about the margins or the despite of the structures, whereas before my confidence would have been more in what is visible and what is reliable. I would encourage us to keep to that definition of Christian mission offered by Rowan Williams when he spoke about joining in with what God is already doing in the world. And to do that requires agility, a sense of being entrepreneurial, and very much being focused on relationships and partnerships. There is a nuanced political theology in our Christian tradition. I think now we have to learn to act from a minority but convinced position. We are to discern little grains of salt, small glimmers of light, with God at work amongst those who have been closest to God in every epoch, the little, the lost, and the least. With St. Augustine of Hippo and others, we hold to a vision of the city of God, which is still emerging amidst the realities of this world, at times coexisting, and at times sitting in stark dialogue, which requires us to speak. This is one of the reasons why I find the rise of what in shorthand I might describe as a new Puritanism within the Church, with its attendant bibliodolatry and fundamentalism, to be so alarming. The new Puritanism would, of course, argue that they're sitting against the world, but I think they have emerged precisely because of the world. Rather than accepting what is happening and trying to perceive God within the chaos, the neo-Puritanism of so many churches which are deemed to be successful are trying to impose a godly vision onto society rather than working with society to see how God is growing a godly vision within society. Those are two very different approaches. And I do not believe for 1 minute that God has abandoned his world, or that God is absent from it. That is to be faithless. And I think it's the faithlessness that has caused the growth of the Neo-Puritan movement. And such Neo-Puritanism is likely to become just as antagonistic, just as iconoclastic, just as violent, and just as dead-end as it has been in every era that it has emerged down the years. But it does make serious engagement of faith in society trickier, because clearly we mean different things when we use a word like Christian and church. No single politics can be said to be Christian, and no single political critique can be said to be right. Rather, we need a theology of God's action amidst a changing system of human life, which perhaps looks more like the light patches of a brain scan than the patterned system of nerves and brain vessels and organs which you would get from an old-fashioned X-ray or scan. They are pictures of the same thing, but they tell us very different things. One is a picture of where life is emerging, the other of structures and ways and approaches which are there, but which may or may not work, and which may or may not be good. Fourthly, you still awake? Fourthly, unresolved church history. This is my overall catch-all category for all those dreadful things in the past and in the present which make the love of God in Jesus Christ difficult to proclaim, given what has actually happened or as a result of the practice of the church. The ill treatment of women, the abuse of children and vulnerable people, the exploitation of indigenous peoples and their lands, the legacy of slaveries, of racism and anti-Semitism, the ill treatment of LGBT+ people, our complicities in war and violence, the rape of the planet. All this and much more is not going away and will continue to make God talk and Christian ministry challenging. Within our symbolic world, we cannot assume that words like Christian or clergy summon positive or loving assumptions. For many, maybe even most, they summon the opposite, tainted by negativity and by that terrible history. I could speak much about each of those particular issues, but each of them requires to think about the nature of history, intergenerational trauma, meaningful reconciliation, and reparation. There is no single thing which addresses the past, heals the present, and makes space for the future. Rather, there is a kind of intentionality at making steps. But all such steps depend on some common vision of our destination. And yet, at this moment in time, we are far from one mind about the direction of travel. The American Mennonite Paul Lederach argues that the single most important step in reconciliation is the act of imagination. Can you imagine two or more parties or two or more aspects which are riven apart being brought closer together? Think the Middle East. Imagination is in short supply. And as we have learned more about our painful past and the impact of particular Christian teaching, it seems we've often lost confidence in redemption or learning. And I think learning and redemption are very closely related. I might say that we have instead been shaped by a doctrine of optimism, part of that modernist inheritance. Things are generally moving forward for the good. That is a very different vision to one which is shaped by hope. It's not accidental that the greatest modern theologian of hope, Jürgen Moltmann, knew so much about suffering, having experienced the horrors of Nazism himself. And Moltmann argues that despair, whilst understandable, is not an adequate response to suffering and injustice. Rather, we are invited to lean deeper into suffering and into the solidarity of life with the suffering, not only to show compassion, but as the place wherein Christian hope is reignited. So heads in the sand, wishing the past was other than it is, pretending the stories aren't real or as bad as they are, asserting that actions of previous generations are nothing to do with us, or saying that things have moved on, are all deeply inadequate and ultimately acts of despair, rather than choosing acts to imagine the future wherein reconciliation is possible and in which therefore hope appears. So often people suggest suffering, injustice, or pain are reasons for not believing in God. Yet amongst people who do believe in God, that is not actually what I see or know. That's not to say there isn't a big conversation about theodicy, but most Christian people are good at being with, journeying alongside, not coming up with silly, trite answers. Rather, they exemplify a confidence in a suffering God, even if they don't use that language. And we need to articulate and support others to articulate and live this kind of Christian hope. All this sees confusion and despair, questions and arguments, not as faithless things, but instead as faithful things. Triumphalism is despairing. Resurrection is hopeful. They are very different things. And if our Christian story has truth woven into it, then we might expect to see hope being born afresh, the harder it gets. But that is not necessarily what we see in the world or in the church. So finally, I come to the Christian community and ministry in the church today. The 20th century rediscovered the language of the body of Christ, emerging out of liturgical reimagination and the impact of Vatican II. We learnt again to speak about the people of God. We learnt that I and my special communion was an inadequate understanding unless it was also caught up in a wider corporate vision. And with this came changes in governance and organization so that lay and ordained voices all had their say. Ministry broadened out to be seen as beginning with baptism and was a calling for all the people. However, implicitly, most communities in England, certainly within Church of England communities, still expected the ordained to run the church, inspire others constantly at the village fete, and hatch, match, and dispatch with great beauty and elegance. And there is a positive dimension to all this, not least a sense of the ordained as a resident theologian, a leader in faith and community, and a recognition of the need for holiness to be embodied in a person. But now that there are fewer people, older congregations, and strains on buildings and money, that model is certainly not sustainable. However, I suspect neither is that model sustainable, even if it were being done by all the people of God. Because the people of God, they're also few. And where they are younger than most people in here, they are usually working or struggling to live. So they don't have the time and the capacity to do the kinds of things that the church used to do. And if I use my inbox or letter correspondence and any gauge of what is important to people, then most seem to see the church as a service provider there to meet their needs. Like the doctors, I am supposed to be free and available and at the disposal of everyone. And the poor behaviors now displayed in many doctors' surgeries are exhibited daily in our churches. There is often a great concern that things are enacted as I want them to be. I very rarely hear anybody speak of what might be good for others. And when the church nationally or internationally does or says something disagreeable to whoever, then I'm threatened with somebody leaving or removing their donation. And usually they get from me, well, I'm sad about that, but leave. Grow up. Grow up. Because there's such a high level of fantasy as to what really can go on, or about what things really cost, or what things can really be possible. And so I now hear a lot of stories of very badly behaved clergy and of very badly behaved congregations. We simply see what's going on in the world. New structures of discipline, new mechanisms of complaint, all have too often exasperated the issues rather than solving them. Before coming to be Dean of Leicester, I made sure I joined a union and I took out insurance so that I would have money to support me when I'm taken to court. You can't be a public minister in any place these days without doing such things. You could say, well, 'twas ever thus. However, I suspect it was not quite forever thus. There were bits of it, but now it is magnified. And it is symptomatic of how people really are. And it relates to misplaced expressions of fear and anxiety. We seem unable to address the human condition, the nature of sin, and the anthropology which sees us as dependent on God, so that actually we're here to grow in awareness of our strengths and weaknesses, to embrace our ignorance and willfulness and try and do something about them. The theologian Eugene Patterson, an American, has challenged me greatly in his pastoral writing by suggesting that however peculiar or difficult the local congregation might be, that they should be regarded as my principal source of support, wisdom, and fellowship in my ministry. This was quite startling news to me, having been trained at a time in the church where the emphasis was about not making friends with your congregation and being very, very, very clear about the boundaries between me and you. Don't get me wrong, I'm still very clear about them. My space, your space. Well, I don't know quite if Patterson's right, but I've decided I'm going to try and live my life as if he is right and take it as a theological discipline and a theological task of discernment. Life in the church, if I'm very honest, is far from how I hoped it would be. But I realize that if I can't begin to discern something of God there, what on earth does any of it mean? So in these years, I've learned more about recognizing and naming good and naming odd behavior, and working with both with deep respect. It requires a commitment to a maturity and adult way of relating, which recognizes the impact of difference, disagreement, and bad behavior. And the key dimension in all of that is keeping the air flowing, ensuring that new faces and voices are included in our communities. Otherwise, our temptations to become introspective and destructive mean we become dangerous. This requires those in ministry, whether lay or ordained, to grow in greater personal awareness. It requires a befriending of the parts of oneself that we'd rather not own, and a constant attempt at genuine repentance. It is a need for a peculiarly Christian kind of holiness, which, to paraphrase Pope Francis, has both the pleasing odour of the Good Shepherd and the rather musky and even unpleasant whiff of the sheep. The Harvard Business School coined the term to describe our current situation as being VUCA, V-U-C-C-A. It's a rather ugly acronym. A time characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, chaotic, and ambivalent. This is the context for contemporary Christian ministry in Britain today. And I've tried this evening to explore a few of the theological questions that are emerging, which has come as no surprise to me, are also characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, chaos, and ambivalence. Maybe it's what previous generations might have simply described more succinctly as being the mystery of God. God and questions about God, and questions to God. They go on, but they're certainly VUCA. Thank you.
For that. I'm going to need to listen to that again to take it all in. Well, we don't want chaos tonight. We want a very calm question time, please. So if you would like to ask a question, please put your hand up. Someone will be walking around with a microphone for you. Please wait until the microphone comes to you so that we can all hear and that people online can hear.
Can I ask you, and you're talking about the interface with society, what do you see as the place of Scripture in trying to resolve what the Christian message should be to society?
Well, as I said right at the start of my talk, that if there's not an engagement with Scripture, people, and the tradition, then it's not a kind of Christian engagement. So at a very basic level, it requires us to read Scripture. And I'm sufficiently, even though I'm sort of talking about the end of modernism, I've been shaped utterly by modernism. So, you know, that's where I'm kind of, like everybody else, we're where we are. And I'm still shaped by the Reformation instincts, so as quoted by Barth, where I read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And indeed, if you come and find me at 7:15 every morning in the chapel in the cathedral, I'm reading the BBC News pages, and at 7:30 I'm saying my prayers. So so that at a simple level, that's what I want to say. I think one of the things which I learned a lot from working in a very diverse community in Leicester was to be very much more aware of what I bring to the reading of Scripture myself. And I did a lot of reading of the Bible with Muslims, with Hindus, with Sikhs, and so on. And I rediscovered the Bible by reading the Bible with them. And that would be if a Christian wants to apply Scripture to society, get society to read the Bible.
Thank you, first of all, for your talk. I think I'll have to listen to it again. One of the things in developing, this modern technological revolution we're going through, you mentioned about the change between reality and virtual, and what does it mean to be virtual? Is not one point that's one of the, going back to Scripture, one of the scriptural sort of images is God speaking to people through dreams. And surely that's a kind of virtual experience, as if you, yeah.
Well, I said that in the talk, actually, that those stories about daydreaming and revelation and so on, or visions, dreaming new dreams, that certainly chimes in with what I'm kind of noticing in the way that e-technologies are emerging. And the very interesting things, isn't it, as we learn, for example, more about the bots and all the rest of it, how they both behave in ways that can be predicted, and yet the way the logarithms and so on work produce completely surprising things that the scientists can't work out why that has happened, because if you simply follow the maths, it wouldn't. Maybe that they don't know how the maths is working, of course, but it's interesting. Yeah.
In the section of your talk where you were discussing the reality of chaos as a true reflection of what we now see in the world and creation around us, I was thinking that it would appear to be slightly different from the way in which you spend your life as dean of a cathedral which ought to stand for stability. And I remember that, of course, the thing that has excited me more and more in recent years is the fact that choral evensong has at its very heart a total bouleversement. The Magnificat is a song about God overturning order, not creating order. And I'm wondering, firstly, do you agree with me? Secondly, if so, how could you please make choral evensong more chaotic? And I suspect that's not what the visitors come for at the moment, but could it be more of a revolutionary act than it so frequently appears to be?
Of course, we wouldn't be the first to notice that such, but it's always been the minority interpretation of it. And of course, the classic one which is described a lot is how it was removed from the prayer books in India because the Brits didn't want the locals to understand that this new faith they were offering them was actually a revolutionary one. But Gandhi and a few others worked that out later. Yeah, well, it's really, I mean, for me, the most exciting works of art are when you get this interplay between order and chaos. I know this is not, this is me, I'm talking as me, okay. If I go to, I like going to the opera occasionally, and if I go and it's the most trad production imaginable, sung very beautifully and very well, I come home and say, well, what was that about? Whereas if I go and it's, I don't know, punks romping around in 1960s London and yet singing Figaro, I mean, I mean, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it's silly, but at its best, when you get the juxtaposition of the two things, then it is absolutely amazing. There was one choral evensong that's happened during my time when there was a visiting choir who were very good, and they sang a setting of the Magnificat by James Macmillan, which was extremely long, and I could tell most people in the congregation were thinking, what on earth's going on here? This is going on forever. Whereas I thought it was absolutely electric, and at the end of it, I hardly knew what to do with myself. It was so powerful. So I think revolution can go on in choral evensong, and I think it even does go on sometime in choral evensong. But it's getting this play between the order and the chaotic, which I think makes liturgy really work. We've seen it in the cathedral over Christmas time, where instead of the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, we've had a chunk of another text that most people in the congregation had no clue what it was. It was a bit of Athanasius, which is the third great creed of the church. And so something very old can also be chaotic. Can't you, Richard?
I found it very interesting what you said about Luther picking up on justification by faith because, and this I didn't know, there was a huge preoccupation with jurisprudence. Very interesting reflection. And I wondered if you feel is it chaos that you're seeing as the preoccupations now? Is that the one into which we should be speaking, or might there be others?
Yeah. Well, I suppose with the Luther thing, because it was popping up all over the places and you get it in different discourses of the Reformation, that gives me confidence to say it. So when I talk about chaos, I'm not hugely confident about it. I'm just trying to kind of grapple with something. I think there are some other things which I think we see in other generations. So the quest for integrity, I think, is another one. I see young people not very interested in truth, but in integrity, walking the talk as opposed to just talking the talk. So I think there's something to match the chaos. There are some other positive emergences around as well. I think the current identity crisis going on in individuals, in gender, in people, in communities, I think that's more to do with the chaos than a new thing. I would put it in that sort of bracket. I suppose there's also, the beginnings of a different globalism, tentatively. I mean, the most positive bit of e-communication is that kind of discourse, and sometimes it can be incredibly creative and interesting, and the fact that you can have a seminar with somebody from every corner of the world all in the same room together talking about the same issue. I mean, think about how long that would have taken to happen in the past. Papers published, conferences, new books, review, whereas you could gain as much from that conversation as it would have taken years and years of the same kind of discourse in the past. So there are some positive things, but I'm tentative.
David, I thought what you said was utterly electric. And no doubt at 7:15 recently, you will have read that the Church of England statistics for the year 2022 have come out, and that we know that we live within a declining church. It's been declining in terms of membership for some while, but COVID has knocked this rather for 6, and now 1 out of every 5 who used to come before COVID doesn't. Could you just comment about this and say where it fits into the church's ministry of today and how it should be conducted? Because for many, it's just bewildering to know where to go and what to do.
So again, it's always easier to say what we shouldn't do than what we should do, but certainly one of my reflections is that we should see those statistics and understand them within the epoch sweep of what I was talking about tonight, which, you know, in another talk is a talk about the emergence of secularism, post-secularism, and all that goes with that. Certainly within the Western world, I think it's a different conversation in the Southern Hemisphere, and the Western world certainly mustn't superimpose its trajectory of those things on the South, which is what I've read Western theologians do. So we're at a time when these things are at a low ebb, and membership of the church is very low. But what's our anxiety really about? What is our anxiety really about? I suspect our anxiety is about the loss of the familiar and all of those sort of things that go with it. Whereas I'm not sure that's really, I mean, I understand that. Pastorally, I understand that. But I'm not sure that's where we should be putting our attention. I think we should put our attention where God's attention goes, which is, as I said, to the little, to the least, and to the lost. And I think churches of whatever hue, which are growing, all bear witness to those things. Whereas, you know, I was an archdeacon in Leicester for a while, and, you know, I came to love the people of the rural benefices of Leicestershire, but the conversation was about saving the church. I'm not sure God's that interested in that question. It's a poor answer, Richard, but that's where I would start with those things. And that might seem ironic for the dean of a cathedral who spends his time trying to think how on earth he's going to pay the bills. You know, how does that stack? But even when I'm doing that, I'm trying to think, how does this place talk to the least, the lost, and the little? And I think we are. I think we are. But of course, you don't make somebody less anxious by telling them not to be anxious. I think what you do is you find something else to put attention on, and you start paying attention to that.
Is that yes? Thank you, David. You've challenged us very radically indeed, and such a lot that we could pick up on. Well, let me say that for 50 years I've been paid to be a pre-modernist. I've never had any great faith in modernism, nor in postmodernism, come to that. So some of this doesn't necessarily wash over me. It does cause us deep disquiet. But so let me just pick up upon one thing that you said. And indeed, the sort of electronic world which we now live in is enormously interesting with, as you say, benefits and challenges. And incidentally, I wasn't going to say this, but I will say it, that one of the great insights, you know, in all this came from the esoteric school that followed Theosophy and Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. And to my mind, one of the most remarkable pieces of writing and insight was from Rodney Collins Smith, and I'd like to talk about this sometime. He predicted the electronic world, you know, in the 1920s and 30s. That this is deeply in that tradition, but I know that's not something that we're given to talk about very much in the Anglican Church. I didn't mean to say that, but the thing that I did want to pick up on was trade and technology. As I say, I've been paid for 50 years to sort of look at this and look at its history. And it's the point you made at one point in the talk, when you talked about the herdswoman and the fact that she's got a cell phone, you know, that she can trade. You see, I think as far as the electronic world is concerned, this explosion of stuff that we get on Facebook, most of it is trash, of course, it's trash, and we should be ignoring it, really. The herdswoman, okay, she can trade, I'm not sure what she trades in, but the fact is, it's corporations who trade. That's the point. I was reading a very interesting piece just a few days ago by, I think it was Jane Swift, you know, the theologian in Oxford, in Prospect, a principal of Harris Manchester College. And what Jane was saying in that piece was power. You've got to link power with this new means of communication and forming transactions. So, okay, the herdswoman can trade, but actually that's not very much. But the fact that corporations now, in a sense, govern the world, and behind the climate crisis and the oil giants and all the rest of it, this is what we need to worry about, and it's their access to electronic media that I will be most bothered about.
Corporations are undeniable a big part of this. But like the state, I think they're less relevant than they were. The relationship between the individual and the corporation, of course, is another discourse. But when you think that Elon Musk as an individual has more power than many countries of the world at his fingertips, suddenly the individual, bolstered by technology, has capacity that was not there before in the individual. Before that, the individual always needed the army, the whatever behind them. They don't need it now. Yeah.
Thank you. I was very inspired by a lot of what you said, particularly about the comments you made about what I would call ethical and moral issues. And I went through a phase of having a question about should the church get involved in politics, but I think it's broader than that. And what I'm saying is really in response to the person at the back who talked about the diminishing numbers going to church, the diminishing belief in a God. But yet, on the other hand, we can see a great interest in what you might call how to lead your life. What are the right things to do? How we should live. Now, that sometimes goes into politics, but sometimes it's not. I mean, thoughts of mindfulness and, I'm talking to you, I have a lot of grandchildren. They're clearly interested in these issues. Now, I suppose the question I have, I haven't got an answer, but maybe you haven't either, but how can the church engage with people who basically don't believe in God, but are very concerned with the sort of things you've talked about this evening?
Well, at a very simple level, I look at my diary every week and ask myself, how much time have I spent doing churchy things? And have I done non-churchy things at all? And that's just one way for me to try and kind of make sure that I am engaging with a much wider sphere of people than simply the echo chamber, which is the church. So at one level, it is just about making the contact and keeping listening. But I'm also interested in virtue ethics and how the relationship between the practice of things and the meaning of things. And I think at some of the most interesting times of the church, it has lent very heavily into practices, Fish and Fridays. And now we don't think of those things as practices. We think of them, I don't know, as constraints the church placed upon people. And at times, of course, they were. They were also used as controlling devices. But at their best, they were instincts about what a healthy life looked like. You know, you needed so much protein in a week. You mostly ate vegetables, but you were allowed a special meal with a higher degree of protein once a week, which was fish. You know, and so on. So I think the church should be offering opportunities for mindfulness and silence and you know, corporate litter picking and all these things which are reinventing themselves in non-churchy worlds, and which the church itself is no longer doing because it's too busy raising money to fix the lead on the roof. I think we should stop fixing the lead on the roof and start doing our rambles again, or whatever we were doing before. Regular human practices together and talking about what happens as a result of doing them and reflecting on them together. I bet you talk of God will emerge, and it won't emerge from the people who claim to talk about God.
The image that's come to my mind is of Abraham going out into the unknown, not knowing whither he was going. The trouble is, most of us in the church today don't want to go into the unknown chaos of the future and are frankly terrified by it and don't understand it. How can we create a sense of excitement, the sense of hope about which you were talking, to elderly congregations moving into this unknown, chaotic future?
Well, I don't know. But my guess is that we learn to talk about these things as part of our language, not as part of language that belongs to somebody else. And I think the way the church has done that in the past is essentially through liturgy and hymnody and prayer, all of which depend on poetry, actually. And that seems to me, you know, the way the prophetic literature comes down to us. It's largely poetic literature. So it's dealing with really difficult, fearful things, but it is given to us in very highly crafted ways, not exactly with iambic pentameters, but bits of it with iambic pentameters, but certainly with the kind of the disciplines of reflected public talk, which is poetic, I think. And whilst, you know, I say this with huge bias as somebody who loves poetry, but I think it's that kind of task. It's no good just talking about the problem. People can read the newspaper and find that out. When people are involved with the faith community, they need to hear the problem being talked about in a different way, framed by a different vision. And I think it needs to be corporate as well. So I think at our peril, do we ignore the fear? Because I think what in places like Northern Ireland, I learned that in communities that have been impacted hugely by fear and violence, you don't make them peaceful by telling them to be peaceful. You get them to tell their story about their reality of fear and violence. And the more they get into it and the more painful it gets, more the longing for life to be different emerges in them. Hope ignites. And then they have to find a way about speaking about it in which everybody in that group can understand and own. That can take a long time. But it is a kind of poetic task.
You had a comparison with doctors, which is a very old one, there's a 15th century comparison with the priest is the doctor of the soul, the same way as the physician is the doctor. But that was against the background, wasn't it, where there was also an understanding that the priest had a particular function and the church had a function in displaying the awe and majesty of God, in a sense, and the importance of the sacrament. And of course, you're a custodian of something that is an expression of the awe and majesty of God, a standing in stone, in the same way, say, the Sanctus of the B minor Mass is a musical, does the same thing, music. And isn't it possibly quite important that we maintain this here, because when people come into a church or a cathedral and there's anything going on, or indeed possibly if it's just quiet, that this is possibly one of the important gateways back, alongside, of course, a lot of the other things you were talking about. But I don't think we should underrate the importance of the symbolic side of demonstrating the awe and majesty of God and maintaining, well, what I call the sacrifice of the Mass, other people call the Eucharist.
Yes, no, I agree, Joe, and certainly that's why I tried to set the common ground at the start of my whole talk by putting some markers down that I thought were important: prayer, pastoral care, the mission of God, and those in tangible, recognizable ways. So and particularly, I think in very public buildings like cathedrals or town centre parishes, I still, you know, we used to talk in the 80s about keeping the rumour of God alive, sort of thing, and I think it still has that power. For some people, the story I always tell against it is not about a building, but about the symbolism. I went to be part of a conference in the west of Ireland, an interfaith international conference, which was organised by the Catholic Church. And those of us who were participating in it were sent a letter a week before we were due to travel to say that when we went to Galway, the one thing we mustn't do is wear a dog collar, because it wouldn't be safe. So the semiology, the symbology of religious things is not quite as solid as perhaps it used to be. But I think there are exceptions to that, and certainly the B minor Mass would be one of them, as would Canterbury Cathedral. But I think it is quite complicated these days. David, does he want? One more, go on, let's have David.
In the last few weeks, we've seen an extraordinary example of the importance of art and drama. And for some very intelligent, well-educated people under the Education Act, with maths and English being important, have become computer scientists and politicians and journalists. And it took a 4-week drama to crack that wretched business open. What about the Windrush scandal? Who's going to do? Why do we drag our feet so very, very slow? And can the church produce drama like that will be really thought-provoking and challenging?
That's a wonderful challenge. And certainly since I've arrived, one of the things I've been digging into is the story of the Friends of Canterbury Cathedral and the emergence of the festival. You know, can you imagine anybody commissioning, from the church, can you imagine anybody commissioning a work like Murder in the Cathedral today? It's pretty hard to imagine it, never mind it actually to happen. And yet I think we do need to cultivate our imagination about these things. They're perfectly possible things. And actually my experience, you know, working with commissioning, I haven't commissioned people to write dramas, but I've commissioned people to write poetry and to make new stained glass and new sculpture and so on. And they're desperate to do it. And they need poetic inspiration to do it from places like the church. So I think there is possibility there. I really do think there's possibility there. And I long for a new play in Canterbury Cathedral that would hasten the justice of the Windrush generation, you know, in the place where Abbot Hadrian walked from North Africa and knew everything about slavery in the 7th century, and it's now taken to the 22nd century to wake up to the fact that we still haven't dealt with it. That would be powerful. Maybe that's a good place to stop.
Jennifer. I'll meet you at the top. Let's stand up here, if I may. Put my next down. Before the day that we heard the official announcement that David Montieth was to be our dean, it was being whispered around the precincts and the whole of Canterbury for about 5 months beforehand, along with other names. So I was sort of puzzled, who is David Montieth? So I rang a friend who lives in Leicester. Who is David Montieth? What's he like? He's good news. He's different. He makes a difference. And I think tonight we have heard a remarkably good lecture. I want to hear it all over again, really. Full of wisdom, insight, thought, and it opened new windows in my thinking. It is very good news, David, that you are here. Living in the precincts, I have seen quite a few changes. Good changes. Opening doors. Not just gates, but helping us to open our minds. And I think tonight's talk has helped even more, and I think it will have helped all of you too. I feel David encourages us to be open to change, which is part of the Benedictine tradition. David, it's been a super evening, a wonderful talk, and it is very good indeed to have you and David in our midst. Thank you very much indeed.
Three very brief announcements. First of all, an apology from Danny Whedon, the new minister of this church. He's very sorry he can't be with us this evening, but he had another commitment which he was required to go on. Secondly, if any of you are not on our emailing list and would like to be, you'll find in the vestibule there's a piece of paper that you can add your name and email address to. Please write very clearly. And then thirdly, a reminder that our meeting next month on the 21st of February will be a talk by Philip Bubaya on the Russian Orthodox Church and the war in Ukraine, historical and theological perspectives. It's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. Could I mention to people watching online that the talk in February will not be streamed and recorded. So if you want to hear it, and there are many good reasons for wanting to hear it, please do come and join us in person if you possibly can. We look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much.